It was a sunny afternoon, and the streets were bustling with traffic, the usual hum of city life filling the air. People moved about, going from one place to another, as the sound of tires on pavement echoed across the urban landscape. On the corner of Maple and Fifth, a sleek black Lamborghini roared to a stop, the engine purring softly as the car slid smoothly into a parking spot. The man behind the wheel was tall, dressed in a crisp, tailored suit, and had a confident, almost effortless aura about him. His skin, a rich brown hue, contrasted strikingly with the glossy finish of the car. He wasn't looking to make a statement. He simply appreciated the vehicle. It wasn't a show of wealth, but a display of a hard-earned achievement. The man stepped out, adjusted his sunglasses, and walked toward the entrance of a nearby cafe, the black Lamborghini gleaming in the sunlight behind him. But on the other side of the street, a woman stood outside a boutique store, her gaze lingering on the car. She frowned, scrutinizing the vehicle as though something about it didn't sit right with her. Her name was Karen, and she was no stranger to making assumptions. She had seen expensive cars come and go in this neighborhood, but something about this particular car seemed out of place. After a few moments of deliberation, she whipped out her phone and dialed 911, her voice a little shaky but filled with certainty. "Hello? Yes, I need the police. There's a man here. He just parked a luxury car in front of my shop and he doesn't look like he belongs here. I think he might have stolen it." Karen's voice quivered with every word, her eyes darting between the car and the man walking into the cafe. She clutched her purse a little tighter, her grip tightening as her assumptions grew louder in her mind. "He's walking into the cafe now. You should hurry," she added, her tone tinged with the fear of a situation that felt more like an instinct than an actual crime. Minutes felt like hours as Karen waited outside the boutique, her eyes glued to the cafe entrance. Her grip tightened on the phone as the dispatcher reassured her that the police were on their way. She glanced again at the sleek black Lamborghini, the car's polished surface reflecting the city's bustling life. It was too perfect, too pristine for someone who looked like him to own. Karen's assumptions gnawed at her, fed by an uneasy mix of doubt and superiority. The man walked out of the cafe, a coffee cup in hand. He glanced around, unaware of the scene he had unknowingly become the center of. Karen watched him with hawk-like precision, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. She saw his confidence, his casual demeanor, and that only seemed to confirm her belief. There was no way someone like him should be driving a car like that. Her mind raced. How could he afford it, she thought. What kind of person just waltzes into a nice neighborhood in a car like that and doesn't even seem fazed? It was an odd contradiction. His calmness, the luxury, the incongruity of it all. He looked too comfortable. As she stood there, barely able to hold back her anger, Karen spotted a squad car turning the corner. Her heart skipped a beat. The police were here. The officer stepped out of the car and approached Karen, his eyes immediately scanning the man standing outside the cafe, seemingly oblivious to the unfolding drama. "Ma'am, what seems to be the issue?" the officer asked, his voice steady but clearly prepared for the usual call about a suspicious vehicle. Karen pointed toward the man, her finger shaking slightly. "Him. That man right there. I believe he's stolen that car. I've never seen him around here before, and I've never seen someone like him drive something that expensive. He's a danger to the neighborhood, and I think he needs to be investigated." The officer turned to look at the man, his gaze lingering for a moment. He wasn't sure what to make of it. But before he could speak, the man turned and gave him a polite nod. "Good afternoon, officer. Is everything all right?" For a moment, the officer hesitated. The man's tone was calm, almost as if he had been expecting this. "Just a routine check," the officer said, his voice steady. "We've had a report of a stolen vehicle in the area, and we need to verify things. Can I see your ID, sir?" The man didn't flinch. He simply nodded and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. Without missing a beat, he handed over his driver's license, his demeanor still composed. Karen's eyes widened slightly. She wasn't prepared for what happened next. The officer examined the ID, his eyes scanning the name and address before raising an eyebrow. It was a standard process, but something about the name caught his attention. He glanced at the man, then back at the ID, almost as if he was considering whether it was a mistake. "Mr. James Anderson?" the officer asked, his voice a bit more cautious now. "You're the owner of Anderson's Luxury Autos, aren't you?" The man, James, nodded with a small, almost amused smile on his face. "That's correct, officer. I own the dealership just down the street." Karen's eyes widened in shock. She had been so certain, so convinced that the man didn't belong, but the words hit her like a punch in the stomach. The black Lamborghini, the one she was so sure had been stolen, was not only owned by this man but was likely one of the cars he sold. The officer's expression softened, clearly realizing the misunderstanding. "I see, sir. I apologize for the inconvenience." James smiled politely but with a hint of pride in his voice. "No problem at all, officer. It happens more often than you'd think." Karen stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape as the weight of her assumption crashed down on her. She had jumped to conclusions, fueled by bias she hadn't even realized she harbored. Her mind raced, but she couldn't seem to form words. She had called the police, accusing this man of a crime he hadn't committed. And now the truth was out in the open, but there was no going back. The officer turned toward her, his face unreadable. "Ma'am, it seems there's been a misunderstanding. The man you called about is the owner of the car and a local business owner. I'd suggest you rethink your accusations before making another call." Karen's heart hammered in her chest. The heat rose to her face, and she felt her cheeks burn with shame. She opened her mouth, trying to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The man she had accused of theft wasn't just a stranger. He was someone with a legitimate presence in the community, someone she had unknowingly insulted. James, noticing her discomfort, took a deep breath and turned back to the officer. "I think we're all set here, officer. Thanks for clearing that up." He then looked directly at Karen, his gaze unwavering but not hostile. "Ma'am, I hope this serves as a reminder to never judge someone based on their appearance. I trust you'll be more careful in the future." Karen could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. The reality of her mistake was setting in, but instead of anger or resentment, she felt the sting of guilt. James had every right to be upset, yet he chose to educate rather than confront. The officer gave a nod, confirming the situation was resolved. "You're free to go, sir. Again, apologies for the misunderstanding." With that, James gave a small nod of acknowledgement and turned to walk back toward his car. His steps were deliberate, his posture calm and confident, but Karen couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something important. A lesson had been taught, and it wasn't one that she could ignore. James walked back toward his Lamborghini, the hum of the engine almost a reassuring sound as it reminded him of how far he had come. The officer had apologized, and Karen's humiliation was palpable, but he wasn't one to hold grudges. He had seen this type of thing before, assumptions based on appearances, judgments passed without a second thought. It was all too common, but this time, he felt it was different. This time he knew he could make a point. As he approached his car, he turned to look back at Karen, who was still standing across the street, her posture stiff, her eyes cast downward in what could only be described as shame. He could feel the weight of the moment in the air. It wasn't just about a stolen car or a mistaken identity. It was a reflection of a larger issue. James could have kept walking. He could have simply gotten in his car and driven away, leaving Karen to stew in her embarrassment. But he didn't. He paused for a moment. Then, without a word, crossed the street toward her. Karen saw him coming, and her stomach dropped. She wasn't sure whether she was more afraid of facing him after everything that had happened, or of what he might say next. She shifted her weight nervously, her eyes still averted, and her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her purse. The silence between them grew heavy, and she could feel the tension in the air. James stopped just a few feet away, his gaze steady, but not unkind. "I'm not angry with you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I understand why you might have assumed what you did, but it's a reminder that assumptions can be dangerous." Karen struggled to meet his gaze. I didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice trembling with a mixture of regret and embarrassment. I thought, it's not something I see every day." James nodded, his expression softening. "I get it. But that's the problem, isn't it? You saw something out of the ordinary, and instead of questioning it, you jumped to conclusions. It's not just about the car, Karen. It's about what we think we know about people based on what we see." For a long moment, Karen didn't know what to say. She had never been confronted like this before. It wasn't a confrontation with anger or hostility. It was a challenge to her way of thinking, a challenge to her own biases. The words hit harder than she expected, and she felt an uncomfortable weight in her chest. I'm sorry," she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize. I didn't think." James gave her a nod, signaling that he understood. "It's all right. But this moment, this conversation, it should make you reflect. The next time you see someone, Don't assume you know their story. Don't judge them based on the car they drive or the clothes they wear. It's about the person inside. Karen stood there, struck by his words. She wasn't sure how to process everything, but she knew that somehow she would never forget this moment. It had shaken something in her, something she didn't even realize needed shaking. Before turning to leave, James added, "Take care, Karen, and take the time to think about what really matters. It's never too late to change your perspective." With that, he walked back to his car, the engine roaring to life as he drove off into the distance. Karen stood there, rooted to the spot, as his words echoed in her mind. Karen watched James drive away, the roar of his Lamborghini slowly fading into the distance. The street, which had once felt so ordinary, now felt heavy with the weight of her thoughts. She stood still, staring at the empty road, her mind racing. Every time she replayed the conversation in her head, she felt a deeper sense of unease, not just for the mistake she'd made, but for the broader realization of how often she had let assumptions govern her actions. She had always considered herself open-minded, fair, and unbiased, but hadn't she just proven the exact opposite? In that brief moment of judgment, she had allowed her perception of a black man driving an expensive car to cloud her reasoning. The discomfort she felt now wasn't just about making a mistake. It was about the uncomfortable truth she had uncovered within herself. Karen took a deep breath and glanced down at her phone. She hadn't noticed the missed calls and texts from her friends and family until now. Each notification felt like a small weight on her shoulders. She had been so caught up in the moment, in the drama of what had unfolded with James, that she had completely ignored the world around her. Scrolling through the messages, she came across one from her sister. "What happened? Are you okay?" We heard sirens. Karen hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She could easily brush this off, pretend like everything was fine. But that wouldn't be honest. She had to confront her actions, not only with James but with herself. She typed back a simple message. "I made a mistake. I'll explain later." Before she could overthink it, she sent the message. Then, taking a deep breath, she walked back to her car, deciding she would go home and reflect further. But even as she started the engine and drove away, her thoughts were still with James. The way he had spoken to her, it wasn't just a lesson in humility. It was a reminder that the world doesn't fit neatly into the boxes we build for it. She had assumed so much based on a first glance, based on her own biases. That night, Karen sat in her living room, trying to make sense of everything. The TV flickered softly in the background, but she wasn't really paying attention to it. She couldn't stop thinking about the conversation she'd had with James. She felt a burning desire to make things right, not just for him, but for herself. The next day, Karen took a step she hadn't expected. She drove over to Anderson's Luxury Autos, the dealership where James was the owner. As she pulled into the parking lot, she felt an odd mixture of anxiety and determination. She didn't know what she was hoping for, maybe an apology from James, or maybe an opportunity to explain herself. But deep down, she knew this wasn't about him forgiving her. It was about her learning from her mistake. Karen stepped out of her car and walked toward the dealership. She noticed the sleek cars lined up outside. Everything from high-end sedans to sports cars, all polished and gleaming in the sunlight. But as she approached the front door, she was greeted not with the usual sales pitch or marketing slogans, but with a warm, welcoming smile from the receptionist. "Hi, welcome to Anderson's. How can I help you today?" Karen hesitated, her nerves bubbling up again. "I'd like to speak with James Anderson, please." The receptionist nodded, not questioning her request. "Of course. Please have a seat. I'll let him know you're here." Karen sat in the lobby, the silence giving her plenty of time to think. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how much she had taken for granted. She had assumed James was just another wealthy person with a flashy car, but he wasn't just that. He was a person with a story, with a history. A story that in a way she had dismissed because of her own preconceived notions. A few minutes later, James walked into the lobby, his presence as calm and composed as it had been the day before. But this time there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes when he saw her. "Karen," he said, his voice still steady, but with a slight warmth to it. "I didn't expect to see you here." Karen stood up, her hands slightly trembling. "I wanted to apologize for what happened yesterday. I made a huge mistake. I misjudged you, and I assumed things about you that weren't true." James didn't react immediately. He just looked at her, letting the words sink in. "I appreciate you coming here to say that, Karen. It takes a lot of courage to admit when we're wrong." Karen nodded, her voice softening. I've been thinking about it all night, and I realize now that I've done this before. Not just with you, but with other people too. I've allowed myself to judge based on things that don't really matter. James smiled slightly, the tension easing between them. It's a learning process. The important thing is that you recognize it and want to change. Karen smiled back, her guilt slowly giving way to a sense of relief. I do. And I want to make it right. I wanted to say thank you. For not reacting with anger. For teaching me something I needed to learn. James nodded again, his expression softening. It's all part of being human. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after. The days following Karen's visit to Anderson's luxury autos were quiet. But the lessons from that encounter continued to echo in her mind. She couldn't shake the realization that her entire worldview had been shaken. It wasn't just about her bias toward James or his car. It was about how often she had seen the world through the lens of her own comfort and assumptions. It wasn't that Karen thought of herself as a bad person. She had always prided herself on being fair and open-minded. But it had taken this one moment, this one mistake, for her to realize just how deeply ingrained her biases were. She had always thought she was above judgment. But the truth was, she had been part of the very problem she once condemned. She had never questioned the way she saw the world until now. Everywhere she went, she found herself observing people in a new light. The elderly woman at the grocery store? She wondered what her life had been like, what experiences had shaped her. The young man in the hoodie at the bus stop. What dreams was he chasing? She had never taken the time to really consider these things before. It wasn't just about looking at people anymore. It was about seeing them. Karen spent the next few weeks reflecting on her behavior, talking to people about her experiences and trying to better understand the issues of race, class, and perception. She didn't have all the answers yet. But for the first time, she felt like she was asking the right questions. One afternoon, as she sat in her car on the way home from work, she noticed a news story that made her pause. It was about a young black man who had been wrongfully accused of a crime because of the way he looked. The details were shocking, and as she listened, Karen felt a deep pang of guilt. This was the reality James had been trying to explain to her, that too often, people were judged based on their appearance, not their character, that this kind of injustice wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger pattern that affected countless individuals every day. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from James. Hey Karen, I hope you're doing well. I've been thinking about our conversation, and I wanted to thank you again for coming to the dealership. If you ever want to talk more or learn more about the challenges people like me face, I'd be happy to chat. Karen's heart softened as she read his message. She hadn't expected him to reach out after everything, but she was grateful for the opportunity to learn more. She quickly typed a reply. I would love that. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realize now how much I have to learn. Thank you for being patient with me. It wasn't just about her making amends with James. It was about a deeper commitment to change. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was headed in the right direction. A few days after receiving James's message, Karen arranged to meet him at Anderson's luxury autos. She had already spent countless hours reflecting on her behavior and trying to understand the implications of her actions. But she knew there was still so much more to learn. She wanted to listen to James, not just as the man she had wrongly judged, but as someone who could offer insights she could never have gained on her own. As she walked into the dealership, she noticed the familiar shine of the luxury cars lining the showroom. But this time, the space didn't just feel like a collection of expensive vehicles. It felt like a part of James's world, a world that had been hard for Karen to understand until now. James was sitting behind his desk in the back office, a quiet authority about him that Karen had come to respect. When she entered, he stood up and greeted her with a warm smile. Karen, good to see you again. I'm glad you reached out. Karen returned the smile, though it felt a little more uncertain. She had come here to learn, but she wasn't sure how to begin. Thank you for meeting with me, James. She paused, searching for the right words. I don't know where to start. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, and I realize now how much I need to understand. Not just about what happened between us, but about the bigger picture, about why I made those assumptions in the first place. James nodded, his expression calm, as if he'd expected this conversation. It's good that you're asking questions, Karen. Most people don't even think about it until they're forced to. But that's part of the problem, right? We walk around with assumptions about people every day without even realizing it. We see someone, and we immediately start to categorize them based on what they look like, what they wear, or how much money they have. But we never really know their story until we take the time to listen. Karen sat down across from him, her mind spinning with everything he said. She had spent so long living in her own bubble, assuming that her experiences were universal, that she hadn't fully realized how different things could be for others. "I didn't understand that before," she said softly. "I thought I was being fair, but I wasn't. I judged you, and others, based on things that didn't matter. I judged you because you were driving an expensive car, because you were black, and because I didn't understand your story." James leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "The thing is, Karen, it's not just about the car or the way I look. It's about the history that comes with it. For people like me, walking into a place like this, driving a car like this, there's a history of people assuming we don't belong or that we didn't earn it. But I've worked hard for everything I have, and it's not just about the car or the money. It's about what they represent." Karen nodded, trying to process everything he was saying. She had never thought of it in those terms. She had always seen success as something that came from hard work. But she hadn't realized that for some people, that success was often questioned or dismissed because of their race or background. "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "How do we stop making these assumptions? How do we stop ourselves from judging people before we know them?" James looked at her thoughtfully for a moment before answering. "The first step is awareness, Karen. You're doing it right now. You're asking the questions, and you're willing to listen. But it's not enough just to think about it. You have to act on it. You have to actively challenge your biases every day, even when it's uncomfortable." Karen felt a weight in her chest. This wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But for the first time, she felt a sense of responsibility, not just to herself but to the world around her. "I want to do better," she said, her voice firm. "I want to learn, and I want to make a difference, even if it's just in my own small way." James smiled, a small but genuine expression. "That's all any of us can do, Karen. Start where you are, do what you can, and keep pushing forward. The more people who are willing to have these conversations, the more change we can make." They spent the next hour talking about the challenges of race, class, and perception. James shared stories from his own life, stories of moments when he had been underestimated or unfairly treated. Karen listened intently, taking in every word, determined not to let the lessons of that day slip away. As she left the dealership, Karen felt a deep sense of gratitude for the conversation. It had opened her eyes in ways she hadn't expected. She knew that her journey wasn't over, but it was a journey that had started with a single conversation, a conversation that had changed her life. A few weeks after her conversation with James, Karen found herself standing outside the front door of Anderson's Luxury Autos once again. This time, however, her visit was different. She wasn't just here to learn or seek answers. She was here to do something. After all the reflection, all the difficult conversations, and the moments of self-doubt, Karen had finally come to the conclusion that she needed to put her newfound understanding into action. She had spent the last month working on herself, reading books, attending workshops on diversity and inclusion, and talking to people from all walks of life. She had even made an effort to connect with some of the customers who visited the dealership, making sure to treat them with the respect and care they deserved regardless of their background. Today, she was here to offer something tangible to James and the business that had helped open her eyes. A partnership, one that would focus on promoting diversity and inclusivity in the community, particularly within the luxury car industry. She was nervous, unsure of how James would respond, but she knew this was the next step in her journey. As she entered the showroom, she was greeted by the familiar sight of sleek, shiny cars, symbols of success. But also, she now realized, symbols of how success could be so easily misjudged. She made her way to the back office, where James was sitting at his desk, looking through paperwork. "Hey, Karen," James greeted her, his usual calm demeanor putting her at ease. "Good to see you again. What brings you by today?" "I've been thinking," Karen started, sitting across from him. "A lot has happened since we last talked, and I've been reflecting on the best way to turn my new understanding into something real, something that can make a difference." James raised an eyebrow. "Sounds serious. What do you have in mind?" Karen took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I want to help you grow this business, not just by bringing in more customers, but by making sure that this dealership becomes a beacon of diversity and inclusivity. I want us to use Anderson's luxury autos as a platform to challenge perceptions and stereotypes, to show that people of all backgrounds can be successful in this industry, and that they belong here." James stared at her for a moment, the silence between them thick with expectation. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. "I like where you're going with this," he said, nodding. "You've really come a long way, Karen. I can tell you're serious about making a change." Karen smiled back, a sense of relief washing over her. "I am. I've realized that there's so much more I can do, and so much more I need to learn. But I want to use my position, my voice, to make a real difference. Starting here." The conversation turned to specifics. They talked about how they could implement community outreach programs, how Andersons could sponsor events that highlighted the achievements of people from underrepresented communities in the automotive world, and how they could provide mentorship to young people who might not have access to opportunities otherwise. They discussed ways to challenge the barriers that often kept certain groups of people from entering the luxury car market, whether those barriers were financial, social, or racial. By the end of their meeting, Karen felt more confident than ever in her decision. She was no longer just an observer of change, she was actively contributing to it. As she stood to leave, she extended her hand to James, a gesture of partnership and shared vision. "I'm glad we had this conversation," she said. "Let's make this happen. Together." James shook her hand firmly, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm excited to see what we can accomplish. You've got a lot of potential, Karen. Keep doing what you're doing." As Karen left the dealership, she couldn't help but smile. She knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and there would undoubtedly be challenges along the way. But for the first time in a long time, Karen felt like she was truly on the right path, a path toward change, toward understanding, and toward a future where she could make a difference, not just in her own life, but in the lives of others. And with that, Karen's journey toward a more inclusive world began to take shape. One conversation, one action, and one step at a time.